Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. So, we hopefully just finished watching our kind of prologue to the Cold War, which took a little longer than I wanted. I got a little long-winded, I'm sure it's going to shock everybody, right? Um, but in the meantime, today we're going to kind of look at how the Cold War really gets rolling. And of course, I think y'all probably know this. You should know it because you took world history last year, and world history and American history are almost the same course in the last 3 weeks or so of the courses, um, but the Cold War is not literally a war in the sense of people directly shooting each other on battlefields. But there were several what you would call hot wars, or like real shooting wars, that break out that are connected to the Cold War. Korea is one of them. Vietnam is one of them. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is one of them. There's Cuban Revolution. I mean, you can go on. So there's a lot of hot wars that happen in the context of the Cold War. So it is amazing, and God be praised that this is the case, that the Americans and the Soviet Union never actually went to war physically between 1948 and 1991. That was the case is astounding. We're going to see there's a half a dozen, if not more times, where that was very, very close. And had that happened, you and I would probably have never been born because our parents would have been dead, and it would be sad. So, thankfully, everyone managed to step away from the bomb, and therefore I am here to give you entertaining lectures, hopefully. So. A couple more things before we jump back into the chronology. There's a couple kind of interpretations of the Cold War that people bring. Some people want to say that the Cold War is not really this good versus evil thing, that America and the Soviet Union were both trying to further, even though it was not the same kind of direct imperialism that you saw in, say, the scramble for Africa in the 1900s, or the 1800s, I mean. That it's basically an extension of imperialism, and because Britain and France were falling, we were trying to build up international empires and compete. You know, look, there's some elements of truth to that, but that's not the real story. To me, this really is a true white hat and black hat situation, which does not mean that the United States did everything perfect during the Cold War, because we did compromise with some governments that were not communist, but were also not good, and we'll talk about that as we go. It doesn't mean that we were perfect, but it does mean that you had two countries really kind of competing for influencing the direction of the world, and the bottom line is that one of those countries was trying to influence it towards communism and collective ownership and gulags and political repression and no freedom and all the lives of the individuals subsumed to the good of the state. And the other side was fighting for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, political participation, individual self-determination, Christian civilization. So, to me, I mean, not saying everything was perfect, but there's no doubt that there's a real moral component to this. And America did a lot of things that we really didn't have to do. We really shed the kind of isolationist. We may have overcorrected a little bit. I don't know. In some cases, like getting as involved as we did in Vietnam, but we really shed the whole, we're not going to worry about what happens in the rest of the world. We said, right now we're in the position where for the first time we are truly the most powerful country in the world. We were joining that club of most powerful countries in the early 1900s. But by the end of the war, Britain and France are devastated. And America and Russia stand alone. America and the Soviet Union, I should say, stand alone as the two countries that really are able to influence the direction of everyone else. And we took it upon ourselves to do everything we can to influence the rest of the world in the right direction and prevent the Soviets from doing theirs. And the Soviets were very intentional about trying to lead to communist movements in other countries. Lenin had started, the first Soviet premier had started a terrorist organization called the Third International that was aimed at spreading communism around the globe. And Stalin really had intention of of spreading communism around. One of the prouder moments of my academic career, I took a course in Cold War Europe, and I had a professor who she was a self-described raging liberal who had kind of argued the case that Cold War was more or less a more a morally neutral contest between two imperial powers or whatever. And I actually wrote my research paper in her class on the thesis that that there was an actual moral dimension to the Cold War, and she actually said, "Oh, that kind of actually it's kind of influenced it's made me rethink my theory on some of this stuff, which you don't hear that very often." So I was pretty happy about that. But ultimately, how does this Cold War get started? Well, it gets started really a couple years after the war, 1945. The war's over, but tension is thick between us and the Russians. We don't get along great, even during the war when we were fighting together. In the last video, I talked about how I felt like Roosevelt wasn't aware enough of who Stalin was, but we also knew that, we also weren't best friends with him either. But things really get tense because they'd made all these agreements at Yalta that the Soviets are going to occupy some of these countries, half of Germany, half of Korea, Manchuria, and they're going to give free elections, what they call plebiscites, where people would go to the polls and vote, between sets of constitutions, pro and anti-communist constitutions, and then obviously a lot of the countries in the western parts, countries like America and the British and French, occupied those, and they became, and of course, all of the elections, favored democracies. It becomes very clear that Stalin has no intention of honoring these free elections. They hold the elections on paper, but all the results come back like 95% in favor of the Soviet friendly governments, which is a real telltale sign of a fixed election. I mean, you just don't have 90-10 elections in a place of free elections. I mean, you don't have, Democrats don't win the governorship in California 90-10. Republicans don't win the governorship in Alabama 90-10. So to have to say that 90% of a country wanted the communist government is really a sign that no real election was had. That what happened instead was stuffed ballots and fraud. And fraud that was conducted, with live Soviet troops with AK-47s and stuff outside the polling places, right? So it becomes obvious that Stalin is not allowing free elections in these places. Hungary, Bulgaria, Albania, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia all go communist. But the big kahuna, the one that really throws everything into chaos, is East Germany. There's a major contrast in our approach to the Germans after World War II than our approach to the Germans after World War I. Now, although, to be fair, Woodrow Wilson was advocating a more lenient peace than Clemenceau and Lloyd George were pushing at the Munich Treaty and everything. But nonetheless, it was the case that we had this really harsh peace with the Germans after World War I. It leads to resentment that helps prepare them to accept Hitler and his insanity. And then we're like, you know what? I know that the Germans have just done terrible things, and a lot more of the civilian population was culpable in that than they'll want to admit. But at the same time, we don't want to avoid, kind of recreating a world where Germany can do the same thing. And it's actually, we're going to talk about in maybe in the next video how completely transformed West Germany becomes in a very short period of time. It becomes a very pro-democracy, pro-free market, very prosperous country. East Germany goes the opposite direction. East Germany comes under the control of a Soviet puppet government, and as did all these other Albanian and all these different ones. Basically, when I say puppet government, I meant on paper they had their own prime minister or premier or whatever they called them, but the reality of the situation is that they're not really given real permission to differ from the Soviet Union, and so the Soviet Union really controls them by remote, and is really the puppet master, and the proof of that is going to be seen in like 1956 when Hungary is going to want to kind of buck the Soviet system on some things, and the Soviets respond by sending tanks into the supposedly independent country of Hungary. So these are not really independent countries. There's some really harsh words between the Americans and the Russians over all this. There's this one incident where Harry Truman has a meeting with the Soviet foreign minister, who is a fellow by the name of Molotov, and Truman talks like Truman does, which is telling the truth, so to speak. And the way that Molotov responded was say, no one's ever talked to me like this in my life. He said, well, you're not going to get talked to that way if you'll just do what you said, which is have free elections. But the Soviets weren't going to do it. The real moment, because American public opinion of the USSR really was not that low at the end of the war, because we understood, listen, it is a reality that it's quite possible that the Germans could have won if not for the Soviet Union, okay? So, like, the Battle of Stalingrad is one of the first of the turning points of World War II. The Soviets really bled the German troops out. The Soviets paid, a higher price in terms of death toll than everyone else in the war. So we understood what they had contributed to World War II. So, and some of this, like Gulag stuff that we know now, had not really been revealed. There were, just like, the whole media bias problem is not a new phenomenon. You had people from the New York Times in particular, named Walter Duranty, who won a Pulitzer Prize for a story that was just abject communist propaganda, where he went to Russia and talked about how great it was. So people didn't entirely understand the depths of the evil of the Soviet Union in 1945-6. But 47, 48, we're starting to see what they're doing. And the moment that really puts America in the mood to say, no, we have to put our foot down and fight this, is Winston Churchill, who actually, shockingly, gets voted out of office at the end of World War II because he was far more conservative than the mood of the British public, which was moving in a liberal and even kind of democratic socialist direction, wanted. So they replaced him with an economic left-winger because they thought the war was about won anyway. So Churchill comes to America to make a speech at a university. He was the commencement speaker. It was in Missouri. Was it Fulton? I don't know which college it was, but I remember it being in Missouri. But he's making this commencement speech, and in it he uses this very memorable language where he says that an iron curtain has been pulled across the countries of Eastern Europe. And by that he means East Germany, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Albania, Lithuania, Romania. And with that, when Churchill makes the Iron Curtain speech, he makes it because he really wants to sound the alarm. Stalin's a bad guy. We've got to stop the Soviets. And it has a huge impact on American public opinion. Really turns people's thoughts away from the Soviet Union in a very dramatic way. So it is Soviet aggression that is causing this split in relationship with our old allies. Okay, so what are our options here? Eastern Europe has fallen to communism. It looks entirely feasible that much of Asia is about to fall to communism as well, and it will. What are we going to do? So there's a couple options on the table. Some kind of what was considered the far right-wing option at the time, which was funny how quickly that shifted because, the further right-wing was more isolationist and pacifistic before the World Wars, and that kind of flip-flopped. What was considered the far right-wing option was the idea of rollback, which was actually, using military force to try to remove communism where it had spread and impose, basically take out these Soviet puppet governments and so forth. The problem was it's just not feasible. We're just a couple years out of World War II. We're not long from the Great Depression. The only reason the Great Depression goes away really is because there's so much like full employment during World War II because everyone's going to fight. Everyone's getting money. So, and then all the factories are, all the men are all fighting, and then all the women are getting second jobs at the or getting jobs at the factories making bombs. So, anyway, so we've just started recovering from the Great Depression after a decade plus. We go through the war. We just can't do that. So, kind of the far left wing option is to say, okay, just let it happen. Just the Soviets will do what we're going to do. Just leave them alone. Let's hold hands and sing Imagine, even though John Lennon wasn't around yet. Stupid. That song is so stupid. So what Truman opts for is really the middle road, and the middle road was what they called containment. Containment was the brainchild of a diplomat in the State Department by the name of George F. Kennan. Your book doesn't mention him, and I think that's a real mistake. With all due respect to your textbook, that you don't do a good job at that. You really should know who George Kennan is, because he's one of the most important foreign policy decision makers in American history. Kennan comes up with a proposal called containment. And what he says is, look, we just don't have the manpower and the public support to go in and liberate these countries from the communist occupation. However, if we allow this to go unchecked, the Soviets are just going to, play us like fools, just like Hitler did to Neville Chamberlain and Edouard Daladier before World War II. And they're just going to nibble at one country after another, and you're going to have a red wave of just the world falling under communist control, which is, first off, is a moral evil and terrible for the people under those governments, but also threatens the prosperity of America because we would have no real foreign trading partners and so on, and then would eventually create an immediate, and think about it, if the Soviets took over 2/3 of the world, and they're still feeling expansionistic, then that puts us in national security danger as well as economic danger, as well as our, moral sense being motivated to prevent, these sort of totalitarian governments. So we can't just do nothing. And so what Kennan says is, we're going to take a hard line. We're not going to try to undo where it's been done, but we're going to take a hard line of nothing else is going down on our watch. And so what this becomes, how containment first is manifested, is an announcement that President Truman declares that is called the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine says this: that we are willing to aid militarily any country facing the threat of communist overthrow. That if there is any attempt by communist regimes to take that country over, the United States will defend them with arms, and often with soldiers were implied as a very real possibility if it continued. And so the Truman Doctrine is going to get put to the test pretty quickly in the middle, because in the 1946, the Soviets had some troops in Iran. Iran's an oil-rich land. It would behoove them to be able to take that over if there was a possibility. There was a prominent socialist presence in Iran. And 1946, the Soviets actually pull out of Iran on account of some of this tough diplomacy. So that was one of the first early victories for us. But also in 46, a civil war erupts in Greece. And one of the sides in the Greek Civil War is a communist side. The Soviets were supporting them. And with that, the Soviets also were trying to put a lot of pressure on the government of Turkey as well. And they wanted, if you remember, the Soviets had always coveted, access to the Mediterranean because so many, and the Black Sea and so on, because so many of their ports were cold, and you couldn't always use them in the extreme winter. So they are like trying to nibble away at the territory of Turkey. So ultimately, Truman actually asked for $400 million to send aid to the pro-democracy faction, to the Greek and Turkish governments. Now, $400 million. This is at a time where America, nowadays $400 million. Oh, that's nothing. We just passed a $1 trillion stimulus package, right? This is big money in 1948. I mean, we're just removed from the Great Depression, and we send $400 million of our money to go support the governments of Greece and Turkey, which are not the most important countries in the world. I mean, Greece and Turkey are not Britain and France, as far as geopolitical significance. But we're doing that because we didn't want the Soviets to think they could nibble away at the world, and we didn't want communism to spread any further. We did not want the Greek and Turkish people subjected to communism. So we were willing to give them money to stop that from happening. And so this becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, and it is very successful. The biggest concern that people had, though, was the idea of the communists taking over Western Europe. And this was a real fear in 1945 to 1950 because, first off, several of, European politics tends to be to the left of American politics, right? There's not really many parties in Europe that that an American Republican would feel comfortable voting for, and most of the liberal parties are kind of to the left of your typical American Democrat. So they just have a more liberal culture. Because of that, there were already strong socialist presences. There's already a strong socialist presence in a lot of these countries, particularly France and Italy. And we did not want a communist Italy. We did not want a communist France. Right now France was being ruled by Charles de Gaulle. It was a republic, but they had elected Charles de Gaulle, who was the leader of the Free French resistance troops during the war. But there was a socialist presence. We were afraid that they could take over. And all of the countries of Western Europe are devastated. German bombs have been dropping on them, for years. There's been battles, there's been explosions, factories are down, people are out of work. Let's say that you're an employer, you would like to start a factory and go hire workers. Who are you going to hire when they all died? Right? I mean, so population decrease has caused, a situation where there could be bad economic growth or lack of growth. They're all in debt, we learned our lesson from after World War I of forcing the Allies to try to pay everything back to us. But nonetheless, there's all these debts and all this stuff. So we are really concerned that the same way that Hitler was able to seize on the debt issue and the economic devastation issue and turn Germany towards Nazism, we're afraid that they could do the same thing, turning Paris and Rome and places like that in a communist direction. So we made a bold plan. It was proposed by a general by the name of George C. Marshall, who was one of Eisenhower's right-hand guys. He's one of the top 3 or 4. He becomes the Secretary of State, for President Truman, and it's in that capacity that he comes up with the plan. But he became Secretary of State after being one of the top, 3 or 4 generals in the war. So Marshall, though, is Truman's Secretary of State, and the plan he comes up with is called the Marshall Plan, creatively. And what that is America promises to basically rebuild Western Europe with the condition that the people that accept our money are not allowed to take it from the Russians too. To make sure that we win that bidding war, we put a lot of money into it. This really is one of the great things America's done. We spent $13 billion between 1947 and 1951 on rebuilding the West German countryside that we had just helped to destroy, on rebuilding France, on rebuilding England, on rebuilding the Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg and Norway. And so all these Western European countries, we spent $13 billion in 1940s money. I went ahead, I can't really go access my inflation calculator because I'm recording with the phone, but I went ahead before the lecture and checked it, and this is the equivalent of over $150 billion today. Now, that's a lot of money now. We're a little desensitized because they just passed a $1 trillion stimulus package for the coronavirus thing a few weeks ago, and people are saying that wasn't enough money, we need more. So maybe that's not as impressive now as it used to be, but, when I was your age, it being $150 billion of today's money was really impressive, right? So we threw $150 billion at all these other countries, at rebuilding them over there. And it was a huge thing because it got all of those countries in our corner in this coming Cold War. That because they weren't in that position to kind of play off of both sides. Although France tried a little bit in the 70s, but so with that, Western Europe kind of becomes connected to the United States in a very deep way. Now, part of this also is. There was concern about Russians just they were helping fuel the communist movements in Greece and Turkey and different places, but also there was just concern about them just bringing troops in and just straight up invading, just straight trying to take something. So what America, Canada, and these Western European democracies agreed to was they established something that's very, very important to national security over the last several decades called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it was soon followed by a similar one in Asia called SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty. But NATO's the more important of the two. NATO basically says this. It was a pact at the time. It was about a dozen countries. It's since grown because a lot of the ex-Soviet countries joined when the USSR fell apart. I think now it's 20-odd countries. But it was a dozen countries or so at the start. And what they all agreed to, they basically all agreed that if you try to attack any one of us, you declare war on all of us. So Russia knew, if Stalin had to know it, if I decide, I would love to go conquer Finland, because Finland was a country that the Soviets had coveted and had actually, invaded simultaneous to World War II in what they called the Winter War. If they decided they wanted to go take Finland back, they didn't just declare war on Finland. They declared war on the United States. They declared war on the United Kingdom. They declared war on Spain. Not Spain. I don't think they joined. They declared war on France. They declared war on Italy. They declared war on Austria. Like all these countries, West Germany, the whole thing. And so that was a great deterrent effect on Stalin's appetite for conquest, which, make no mistake, was there. He really did want to grow the Soviet Union. There's some historians that dispute that, but I think it's very clear. And I did, many papers and stuff of deep research on this stuff when I was in college. My thesis paper was on the anti-communist movement and stuff. So, trust me when I say Stalin wanted to expand the Soviet Union and take stuff over. There's even some real rumors that have some grounding in declassified stuff that part of the reason Stalin ultimately dies is that Nikita Khrushchev, who proves to be his successor, is convinced that he wanted to go ahead and start World War III, and they were kind of a little scared to do it at that point in time. If that is true, it would wind up being ironic because Khrushchev, while he did take the finger off the political oppression like this much, for a short period of time before other people, put the hammer back down again. He also brings America and Russia closer than we've ever come to war in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that's 2 videos from now. So, all right. So NATO, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, all of this puts us on a real semi-war footing with the Soviet Union. We're not fighting literally, but we're fighting in every other arena. We're fighting each other economically. We're fighting each other in espionage. We'll talk about that more in the next one. We're fighting each other in diplomacy, and and who can outgive the other country in third world situations. When Americans and Russians would meet in the Olympics, it was the biggest thing in the world, right? I mean, it's just, we were rivals for a very long period of time. The first moment where it really looks like where we've really got to do, where we've got a real crisis that could precipitate World War III happening, happens in Berlin. Now, again, I want to clarify. So Germany is split into two countries. There's East Germany, which is communist, and there's West Germany, which is a democracy. However, inside of East Germany lies the city of Berlin, or the old city of Berlin. Berlin is divided into two cities for these few decades, East Berlin and West Berlin. East Berlin belongs to the East Germany. The West Berlin belongs to West Germany. And the reason for this is because Germany, ultimately, when it becomes obvious that Stalin's not holding the free elections and we have all that tension, the parts of Germany that were occupied by Russian soldiers, they have an election, and 98% of the people vote for communism. And then the western parts, they have an election, they vote to become a democracy, put in a democratic constitution, and those were the parts of Germany that had been occupied by America, England, and France. Well, if you remember, the city of Berlin was divided amongst the four countries. The British, French, and Americans, the regions that they had occupied became West Germany, and also the city of West Berlin in particular. So West Berlin is this one little island of democracy surrounded by communism all over it. Now, ultimately, the solution, and so many people flee from the eastern part to the western part that they're ultimately going to build the infamous Berlin Wall, but that'll be in next time. So, the first real crisis, though, is they wind up. The Soviets decided to blockade the western part of the city, put tanks around it. So that because those people, because West Berlin, it was kind of isolated. It was really required goods coming in from West Germany, oftentimes escorted by British or other military personnel. Because they don't really have a lot of capacity for making goods. They're surrounded by a communist country on all sides. Well, Stalin decides to get tough, because what Stalin wants to do, he wants to take the whole city. And so he puts a blockade of tanks around Berlin. And this is where we have to sit back and say, are we going to go to war over West Berlin? Because he's challenging us to. He's playing chicken, right? This is him making a power play. Are you just going to let me take this? Because the people are going to starve to death if we can't get them supplies from West Germany. They're literally going to starve to death. And the only way around it is to hand it over and say, here, East Germany, you take it, and you're, Stalin, your puppet master, right? But we don't want to do that. But we also don't want to start World War III. Because it's only been a couple of years since World War II. We're not recovered. We're not ready for that. So we have a stroke of brilliance, one of the most genius things we ever did. This happens in 1949. I can't remember whose idea it was, but Truman puts it into practice. It's something called the Berlin Airlift, and it's one of the coolest things that we ever did. So what we decided to do was we started taking, going as close as we could, get airplanes into West Germany. We'd take off from there, and we literally dropped supplies, food, clothing, essential goods from the sky dozens of times a day. Because we couldn't take them by land because we'd have to go through that tank blockade. But, we're going to go... we're just going to go over the city and just drop food everywhere. 100 times. I think I'm trying to look at the precise. I'm trying to see if your book has the precise statistics on how many drops we made on the Berlin airlift. It does not, but it is. But it was formidable. Many, 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 many drops per day. And at this point now it's like, Stalin, if you want to stop us now, you're going to have to literally send the Soviet Air Force into the air and start shooting at our planes that are delivering goods to civilians. And if you do that, you are asking for World War III. And so I know he started it, but now we're going to find out, is he bluffing? Because there's still a danger. I mean, Stalin's a little bit crazy. There's still a danger that he could have just started an air war, but we kind of gambled that he really was trying to get us to give him West Berlin without a fight. Stalin ultimately, I say he backs down. He doesn't really back down. They don't end the blockade for a while. We have to keep this going for a period of time until finally May of '49 they end the blockade. He does back down after a decent period of time. And the difference in prosperity between West Berlin and East Berlin is going to be so stark. Just how different people's lives are on different sides of the border, that people from East Berlin are going to just begin flooding to West Berlin as refugees until ultimately the Soviets are going to literally build a wall to keep people in. Like, it's one thing to build a wall to keep people out of your country, but to build a wall that has to keep people from leaving, it's not a sign that you're doing things well, right? The next year, 1950, a couple things happen that escalate the Cold War to the next level. You know what? For the sake of time, I'm gonna do this in a second part, so this is quicker to load. Hold on just a second. Let me get it started up again.